Another day, another real world test. Today, we're doing a test of the Oppo Find X7 Ultra, the first Ultra phone from Oppo. And while it is a China-only device, which we'll talk about why that is a bit later, I still think it is interesting to see what it can do, even if you don't intend to buy one. Now though, we're going to explore, as per the usual, while we test out this phone. But first things first. Hello. Yep. Coffee. Check. Welcome to Cafe Grumpy, which is kind of like a local chain here in New York City with 9 cafes throughout the city, 1 in New Jersey and 1 in Florida. But this location in an industrial part of the neighborhood of Greenpoint here in Brooklyn is their first location that opened in 2005. And in spite of the name, everyone here is not grumpy. The owners apparently named it that because their goal is if you come here grumpy, you won't leave that way. Now they've been sourcing and roasting their own coffee since 2009, and the coffee's always solid, and because of the little bit further from things this location here is, it's also a bit larger, and it's a great place to sit and work, or study, or maybe film your phone. Which brings us to the design of this Oppo Find X7 Ultra. Now the first thing you'll notice is the giant camera circle with not 3, but 4 cameras in it, making this the first phone with that to come to market when it was released in early January this year. But we'll get to those in a bit. Around that, we have our same two-tone look from the X6 Pro that I really liked, and we have a new dual color of white and blue, in addition to the orangey brown that we had on the X6 Pro, which I also liked a lot. We also have the same vegan leather material from that phone as well. Now the X7 Ultra is a hair thicker and a hair heavier than the X6 Pro, but you'd be hard pressed to notice if they weren't just side by side. We also have a 6.8-inch AMOLED 120Hz display that even supports Dolby Vision and HDR10+, and can hit 2600 nits in daylight versus the 1700 of the Find X6 Pro. And the pretty curved display I'm sure will annoy a decent amount of you guys, as that seems to be a trend beginning to wane for manufacturers in favor of less curved at least, or even flat displays. We also have an IP68 rating, as is standard these days for phones really, which means it can be submerged in up to 1.5 meters of water for up to 30 minutes. We also have a 5000 milliamp battery, which we'll test by the end of this video, and it comes with a 100 watt charger in the box that can charge it from 0 to 100 in about 30 minutes apparently. We're here at McGolrick Park, just a bit south of that cafe, and I feel like this is one of the hidden gem parks here in Brooklyn. It's small and quieter, it has a farmer's market during the warmer months, and has some pretty stonework as well. The Shelter Pavilion, built in 1910, is the focal point of that stonework, built of brick, limestone, and wood, and was designed by Hemley and Huberty, the architecture firm that designed the Greenpoint Savings Bank not too far from here. The design was based on the Trianon at Versailles, although smaller and more modest maybe, and it's complemented by 2 monuments nearby. The World War I memorial built in 1923, which was built to honor the 150 soldiers from Greenpoint who fought in World War I, and the Monitor and the Merrimack, which was built to honor the designer of the USS Monitor, the first ironclad warship, which was built not too far from here on the East River, and the USS Merrimack, another one of the first ironclad ships in the US Navy. Okay, and the park and the structures is probably a good place to test out the big deal on this phone and the reason we're kind of checking it out. The cameras. Like the Oppo Find X6 Pro, all of the cameras on here are 50 megapixels, but we have 4 of them instead of 3. Firstly, we have a slightly smaller and slightly wider 50 megapixel f2.0 1x1.95 inch ultra-wide sensor with 1 micron size pixels that get binned by default in sets of 4 to get a 12.5 megapixel image with 2 micron size pixels. Last year, we actually had a 1x1.56 inch sensor, so it was larger, but the f2.0 aperture is faster than the f2.2 from last year, with the idea that maybe that might help make up for that. Then again, same as the X6 Pro, the X7 Ultra has a 50 megapixel f1.8 main 1-inch type sensor that has 1.6 micron sized pixels and gets binned by default in sets of 4 to get a 12.5 megapixel image with 3.2 micron sized pixels, which is actually pretty massive. For perspective, the iPhone 15 Pro Max and the S24 Ultra main camera pixels are about 2.4 microns when binned. This means more light can come in, and theoretically there should be better low light, although software makes a big difference as usual. And even though it has a similar aperture to those two other phones, the larger sensor means that the bokeh effect, or the blur between the background and foreground, is also more pronounced. Whether that's good is up to your preference, but most of the time, your average person will look at that image and say it looks better the more bokeh there is. Then again, we have the same 2.8 times optical telephoto lens that is a 50 megapixel f2.6 1x1.56 inch sensor with 1 micron sized pixels that get binned by default in sets of 4 to get a 12.5 megapixel image with 2 micron sized pixels. Now, in the phone, it lists this as a 3 times zoom, by the way, just so that you're not confused by the 3 times text for all of these photos. It's apparently Oppo doing a 3 times zoom with the 2.8 times optical lens. And new this year, we have a 6 times optical 50 megapixel f4.3 1x2.51 inch sensor with 0.7 micron sized pixels that get binned by default in sets of 4 to get a 12.5 megapixel image with 1.4 micron sized pixels. And finally, we have the same 32 megapixel f2.41 by 2.74 inch sensor with 0.8 micron sized pixels that weirdly don't get binned at all for the front camera. Now, as always, the hardware only tells part of the story, as the software these days is doing a lot of the heavy lifting. But Oppo seems to have worked a bit closer with Hasselblad, the historic camera company, and created what they call a hypertone image engine, which is a more involved effort between the two companies to adjust the color science. Personally, I think it's a little more muted, but I like it. But as per the usual, I'll leave it up to you guys to be the judge of how it does compared to the other phones in this video. I will say though that the huge main sensor and that bokeh effect is something I really enjoy most of the time, and the 2 telephoto lenses at 3 times basically and 6 times optically are super handy to give you a lot more options to shoot without feeling like you're going to get too much of a lower quality shot when using them compared to the main camera. There's definitely less quality, but it feels less so than on some other phones at least. Now, in honor of this phone being a Chinese-only release, there's a newer location here in Greenpoint for a Chinese restaurant that I've been wanting to try that is usually a pain to get into at their other locations ever since the original East Village one opened in 2015. It's called Mala Project, and this location opened last year, and I've just kind of been forgetting that it existed. Now, the big draw here is their build-your-own dry pot stir-fries, where you can choose from about 60 different ingredients to customize it. Now, even though that sounds like a lot of decision pressure for me, they're hard to get wrong. There are your usual meat options like chicken thigh, pork belly, and sirloin, but there's also some more funkier cuts like beef tendon and pig intestine. After you decide on that, there's a ton of veggie, mushroom, and fish options to add, as well as starches like sweet potatoes and taro. And you finish the decisions with noodle and tofu choices, as well as your level of spicy that you want. Now, this might be the fact that I didn't have to wait in any sort of line and made my reservations the day before, but with that, I'd say it lives up to the hype. While we're here though, let's talk about the software. Now again, this is only available in China, and so it comes with a lot of Chinese programs, as you'd expect. I removed most of them, but there's a couple that I've left. Now, the issue for everyone outside of China is that while you can sideload the Play Store and the apps that you're used to working with, they are a little wonky sometimes. Freezing is more common than I'd like, for example. In addition to that, it seems you can change your default apps, but it's a trick, and you actually can't. So, for example, if you want to use Google Messages, you'll be forced to approve every single text message you send in the name of the operating system trying to protect you. There's also something in ColorOS that bothers me even on the global versions, like the fact that I have to basically swipe twice or swipe and tap to get rid of a notification because of how they implemented the release when you're done swiping. It just, you have to do it all the way across. It just is unnatural, and so you end up just swiping twice. Or when I select a quick action in a notification that normally would remove the notification on every other phone because you know that action means that I'm done with the notification, it just stays here instead. Not big deals really, but when it happens enough, it tends to kind of cheapen the experience a little. Now, a global version of this phone would at least alleviate the bigger issues that I have with like freezing, default apps, etc. But Oppo has no plans to release a global version of this device. Now, the reason is simply that the US isn't a market for them yet. OnePlus, their subsidiary, has that market for now. And they were sued and stopped from selling phones in all of Europe because of a patent they infringed on that belonged to Nokia. But as of not too long ago, they announced that Nokia and them have come to an agreement, and they will begin selling the Find X series in Europe ASAP. So, even if this phone isn't available, here's to hoping that some of the camera features especially make it into future globally released Oppo phones. And lastly, here's my usage and screen on time for anyone who's curious about that for today. But as always, keep in mind that this was a real world test day and not a normal day, and I used my camera way more than you ever would. But here is another day that it was not a real world test day, so that you at least have something to compare it to. And with that, calling it a night. Good night. But as per the usual, screaming child. There's a lot of children in the park today. Isn't it a school day? Shouldn't they be in school? Delinquent children, all of them.